Welcome to episode 20 of the Time Talks podcast, part of the Channel Zero Network. My name is Chris Time Steele, and I'm happy to start off 2020 with this episode featuring the legendary linguist, philosopher, political commentator, anarchist, activist, author, and revolutionary Noam Chomsky. I first got in touch with Noam as a young journalist during Occupy Wall Street. I was writing articles about Occupy Denver and was threatened with slap suits. My good friend Tim, also known as the hip-hop artist Soul and host of the podcast Soulcast, told me to reach out to as many people as I could for support. One of the people I emailed was Noam Chomsky. Not knowing Noam returns emails better than most of my friends, he wrote me back in support of what I was doing. This led to me eventually collaborating with him on research and interviewing him twice at MIT. One of the interviews was published in his book, Occupy: Reflections on Class War, Rebellion, and Solidarity. I'll link that chapter titled, There's Always a Class War Going On, in the show notes. Since then, we've kept in touch. He graciously decided to give an interview for my podcast. In this episode, we discussed anarchism and its influence, Palestine and internationalism, mutual aid, the group doing important work called No More Deaths, the Pentagon Papers, and anti-war protests. If you haven't read or seen the documentary Manufacturing Consent, I highly recommend it. His recent documentary, Requiem for the American Dream, is excellent. I highly recommend Necessary Illusions by Noam and his recent books on Western terrorism, from Hiroshima to drone warfare, Masters of Mankind, and on Palestine. If you're into his work on linguistics, the science of language is great and a really important work. If you can please support this podcast on Patreon, it's patreon.com/Time Talks. Big thanks to Awareness for the music. And here's a jingle from fellow Channel Zero Network member, Soul.
We are at war!
The Soulcast is a twice-a-month anarchist podcast hosted by North American rap artist Soul. It's a podcast about revolutionary politics from an anarchist perspective. Every month, I interview academics, journalists, revolutionaries, quote-unquote activists, artists, musicians, and really anything that I find interesting. I never got to go to college, so this, I guess, is my cheat sheet. So anybody who wants to learn, you can learn with me. Subscribe in iTunes at tinyurl.com/Soulcast and check it out on the Channel Zero Podcast Network.
We are at war!
Hello?
Hey, Noam. How you doing? This is Chris Steele.
Hi. Yeah, let's go ahead.
So my first question is, I wanted to ask you about anarchism. And I first contacted you and interviewed you in your office regarding surveillance, the Paris Commune, and Occupy Wall Street. And with anarchism in the Spanish Civil War, with the Zapatistas with elements, and direct action shutting down the World Trade Organization, and Occupy, and now the environmental movement, you were exposed to anarchism at an early age. And I was wondering, how has anarchism progressed, and where do you see its role in the future?
Well, first of all, we should bear in mind that the term anarchism covers quite a wide range of thinking and activities. If you look back, and the term itself has a derogatory connotation, thanks to the workings of the whole world propaganda system. Over the years, the term anarchism has come to mean to people something like violence, terror, destruction, elimination of all order and organization, and so on. But that's not what the mainstream of anarchism ever was. I mean, fringes were. But anarchism calls for a highly organized society, but organized by the participants without illegitimate hierarchy and domination. That calls for a high degree of organization, but based on solidarity, mutual concern, cooperation, shared information and understanding, and so on. How's that changed? Well, for a long time, it always exists in human life, but it doesn't exist as a recognizable element of society. In the 60s, it began to change. because the activism very much took these forms, even if the word wasn't used. Freedom riders in the South, let's say, were living in a society that they created of mutual aid and support and common decision making and so on. The early feminist movement began to have some of the same properties and so on, and it's happening again today, with especially with the rise of the environmental movement among young people, but much beyond that. So there are things developing in the world that we don't call anarchism, but are elements of a potential anarchist society. So take things like when the big steel mills shut down in Youngstown, Ohio. That they had been built by the community. They were the major contribution. They were a community creation to a large extent, and the community fell apart, not just the workforce. But instead of just disintegrating and peering, they began to organize in a participatory form. This was with the help of intellectuals who were interested in it. Stoughton Lynn, a labor activist and lawyer, longtime activist. Garo Perovitz, who'd been working on ideas of this sort for a long time and have now developed in Youngstown, and in fact the former Rust Belt altogether, including Cleveland, a network of worker-owned, worker-managed enterprises, which are based on participatory mechanisms. They're, of course, embedded in the broader state capitalist society. But those are the kinds of things that the great anarchist and 19th century figure Michael Bakunin was talking about when he referred to the task of trying to build the germs of the future, the elements of the future within the existing society. And I think so there are many ways in which this is taking place, and it's kind of ideas that have come to the surface more than in the past, in the recent past at least. And of course there are developments, independent developments, which have been pretty exciting, like most recently in the Kurdish areas of Syria, the Rojava area, where they've tried to institute a strongly feminist, communally based, on the model of Mary Bookchin's work, society, which has now been betrayed to its worst enemies by Donald Trump. Something may survive.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I'd like to talk about the value of internationalism and mutual aid and how these tactics could aid Palestine. We often see internationalism going in the wrong direction, with the Israeli Defense Force training police officers in the U.S. on repression techniques. But the scenario is often flipped, like when Palestinians and communities in Ferguson with Black Lives Matter showed solidarity and shared tactics. Can you speak on this internationalism in Palestine?
Well, as you correctly point out, there's two kinds of internationalism. Mm-hmm. There's the internationalism of the powerful and the repressors. There's the internationalism of those struggling for freedom and elementary rights. And that's always been true. So go back to the American Revolution, for example. There were the British were fighting with forces from Germany, Hessians. The Americans had supporters from France, like Lafayette. And it goes on like that. There's always, through history, we see both tendencies. The rich and the powerful have shared interests, and they cooperate to try to achieve them. When the U.S. backs a right-wing military coup in some Latin American countries, that's mutual aid of the rich and powerful. When during the 1980s, we saw a pretty amazing development phenomenon, which is rarely discussed because it's much too frightening. This was the first time in history that mainstream, ordinary people, by the thousands, went to a country that was under attack by their own states, not only to give some aid, but even to try to participate in their lives, to give what help comes from having a white face in your midst. Nobody ever thought of going to a Vietnamese village or in France to an Algerian village when the United States was destroying Indochina and France was crushing Algeria. Now, these are ideas that never came to people's minds. But in the 1980s, it happened by the tens of thousands in the United States and from all over the country. Evangelical churches in rural Kansas, for example. It wasn't just the young people who were derided as Sandinistas. That's an amazing phenomenon of internationalism and mutual solidarity. Very important, which is one of the reasons why it's kind of written out of history. It's not the kind of thing that people are supposed to have in their minds. But it's there, and it came. Nobody could have predicted it. Came out of nowhere. It's right below the surface, I think, all the time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So my next question is, you've rightfully called Tucson occupied territory, and all of North and South America's indigenous land. With the current situation of children dying and being imprisoned on the border, can you speak about how this is part of the ongoing legacy of colonialism and genocide, and what you see being done about rectifying colonialism and bringing justice to stolen land?
Well, that's another pretty amazing phenomenon. Arizona altogether is not exactly a leftist paradise, but if you take Tucson, where we're living, the solidarity with the most reviled people is quite extraordinary. Nobody is as reviled in the American propaganda system as much as refugees fleeing for their lives from the countries we've destroyed in the South. I don't have to tell you about it. It's shocking. But there are groups here in Tucson, one group called No More Deaths, mostly young people, some others, who go out into the desert, which is very harsh and forbidding, set up camps where refugees can come to receive a little medical aid, a little food, a place to rest, to send them on their journey through the territories controlled by very brutal border controls. They leave bottles of water in the desert, which is a crime. Some are brought to court. Interestingly, in this city itself, there's a fair amount of solidarity. When they're brought to trial, there's been a couple of federal trials recently, one ongoing now, and the support for the defendants is pretty strong. You drive around the city, you see on people's lawns signs saying humanitarian aid is not a crime. In fact, in the major federal trial just a couple of months ago, there was a guy on trial who had a felony charge with possible 20-year sentence for giving assistance to people fleeing for trying to survive in the desert. Scott Warren.
Yeah, Scott Warren.
He came. It was a jury trial. He was freed by the jury by 2-1. That's local people, hearing the standard propaganda about these rapists and robbers and Islamic terrorists and murderers coming to kill us. So you have that. But you have the opposite too, of course. Mm-hmm. But one of these camps a couple months ago out in the desert before it was dismantled by the Border Patrol, and it was pretty impressive. Very primitive, of course, but meant little possibility for some help and succor salvation for desperate people.
Yeah, they're no more just doing amazing work. Thank you for sharing that. My next question is, with the recent escalation in Iran, people are having recollections of the anti-Iraq protests, which were the largest in history and didn't stop the war. You've mentioned an important overlooked part of the Pentagon Papers is towards the end, where advisors were that if protests kept escalating in the U.S., troops would need to leave Vietnam to fight protesters or uphold peace in the U.S. My question is, what does an effective anti-war protest look like in this current age?
Well, I think that is a part of the Pentagon Papers, which is almost never mentioned. It's the very last part of the Pentagon Papers, when after the Tet Offensive in South Vietnam, when the government, Lyndon Johnson, was thinking of sending a couple 100,000 more troops, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff were opposed. They were concerned that they'd need them for civil disorder control in the United States. There's also mounting evidence, first brought to attention by Dan Ellsberg. No more evidence for it. The Nixon administration was thinking seriously of nuclear weapons, but was talked out of it essentially by the massive anti-war demonstrations in Washington. After the Tet Offensive, the government began to slowly disentangle itself from the crimes in Indochina. Plenty of them continued, but they gradually started to de-escalate. The 1980s popular movement that I described, I think, is actually an outgrowth of the Vietnam anti-war movement. There have been careful studies of public opinion on the Vietnam War, starting in 1975 when it officially ended, going on for many years. One of the questions they asked was a lot of different topics, but one of them was people's opinion about the Vietnam War. And it's pretty surprising when you look at it. Turns out that about roughly 70% of the population regarded the war as, I'm quoting, not a mistake, fundamentally wrong and immoral. Those are words you can't find in the intellectual community, the intellectual journals, except on the left, the public media. You don't find that. But that's the public. And that lasted through the 80s, certainly, and at least by the studies. And I think it was a considerable part of the background for the general popular movement of solidarity and direct engagement in Central America. It beat back Reagan's programs. His initial programs were to duplicate what the United States had done in Vietnam, but they backed off pretty quickly because they realized they can't get away with it in the temper of the times. When you get to Iraq, as you said, it's the largest demonstration in imperial history, protest before the war was even officially announced. Now, it's generally described as a failure, but I don't believe that. I think it put constraints on what the government could do. It was bad enough, but it was nothing like what Kennedy and Johnson did in Vietnam before any protests developed. So I think it was a partial success in that respect. And I think we're seeing the same now. There's a wave of protest in the country, some of it, visible in demonstrations, much of it just detectable in people's general attitudes of saying they don't want another war in the Middle East. And maybe that'll have an effect. If that's really up to people like us, to activists and organizers who can commit themselves to trying to turn this from a general attitude of discontent and opposition to an active movement of a very direct protest, which will change things.
Mm-hmm.
Afraid I Gotta take off.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Chomsky, for speaking to me.
Glad to talk to you.
Thank you for tuning in to the Time Talks podcast, part of the Channel Zero Network. I want to thank Noam once again for being part of the podcast and speaking with me. If you can, please share the show, rate the show, support it by word of mouth or on Patreon. Anything is appreciated. Please support my friend Awareness for always providing the tunes. He's on Bandcamp, or you can stream him online. And see you next time.